Hello, my name's Keith Whitfield. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to help you prepare for reading the book of Daniel in the next couple of weeks. The book of Daniel is a relatively short book. It's about 12 chapters or so it won't take you too long to get through it. It is a rich book, though. And just want to spend a few minutes just highlighting a couple of things to draw your attention to as you are reading and meditating on this book. First, let me just say that I think the theme of the book is about God's sovereignty in Him establishing His kingdom over the kingdoms of the earth, kingdoms of the world, and calling all kingdoms, if you will, to be able to bow the knee and to confess that God is, the God of Israel, is the one true living God. It sort of is a book that unfolds Psalm 2, if you're familiar with that psalm. That deals with the kingdoms of the earth waging war against the God of Israel, but God lifting up His Son, who is going to establish a kingdom. And this is the story of the book of Daniel, and it really is a story about hope. It's a story to God's people in the midst of real life circumstances, and not only real life circumstances in the present, but real life circumstances to come. And it's a story about hope, that where it seems at times when there's that the kingdoms of the earth are overcoming, and they are ruling and reigning, and they have ultimate authority. The book of Daniel communicates to us that that is not the case. Daniel is a story that is told through, in some sense, through the lens or through the eyes of Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These four friends came to Babylon after the first of the exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon, after the first attack of Jerusalem from this mega kingdom, if you will, of Babylon, around 607 BC. And Daniel and his friends were some of the early ones. They were young at the time, and all of them are coming from the house of David. And they are recruited to operate, to work, to live in the courts of the king. And they are being pressured from day one to bow the knee to the empire, to bow the knee to the emperor. And they don't. And they remain faithful to the Torah, the laws of God, and devote themselves to living in accordance with those rules. And what we see in the book of Daniel from chapter 1 really through chapter 7 is that because they do that, God lifts them up. God exalts them. So chapter 1, chapter 3, and chapter 6 are about this pressure point in their lives of being confronted by the opposition and the persecution of the kingdoms of the earth in their test of whether there'll be allegiance to the God of Israel or not. And in each case, God demonstrates Himself to be faithful to them and exalting them and lifting them up and promoting them and rescuing them. Rescuing them in chapter 3, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, rescuing them from the fiery furnace. And then in chapter 6, rescuing Daniel from the mouth of the lion's den. Another interesting things to see in this book is that while there's this really simple sort of division that takes place from 1 to 6 to 7 to the end, there's actually something a little bit more complex happening in the book. And I just want to draw your attention to this as you're reading it. And this is something you may not see naturally because we don't have the original manuscripts of Daniel in front of us when we're reading it. We would see it immediately if we did. What we would see is this, that chapter 1, chapter 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew. Chapter 2 through chapter 7 are written in Aramaic. It's almost suggesting that these chapters, 2 to 7, are written for the entire region, if you will, because Aramaic would have been the language of the day. Everybody would have had access to it, would have known how to read it, those who were able to read. So this would have been for everybody. But then the other ones were maybe only for God's people, for the Israelites. And then what we see, though, is we see this chapter 2 to 7 is a cluster of chapters communicating a message. And the message is being communicated around two dreams. Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Chapter 7, Daniel's dream. And then two rescue events. Chapter 3, the rescue from the fiery furnace. Chapter 6, the rescue from the lion's den. And then through two sort of encounters and responses, if you will, of kings to the authority of God. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar. And Nebuchadnezzar is humbled and confesses and is restored. Belshazzar is not humbled, and he is ultimately assassinated. And then chapter 2 tells us in this dream of Nebuchadnezzar that this Babylonian rule, the kings of all kingdoms of the history of the world here, has got power, is the head of really the world at this point, is going to one day be torn down. This rock comes in and smashes the statue that represents the greatness of Babylon. And then chapter 7 is the dream of Daniel, and you've got these beast images of representing these various kingdoms, and the story there is about the destruction of the great and mighty kingdom of Babylon. From chapter 7 on, chapter 8 through the end, gets at the end of Daniel's ministry. And Daniel had been in ministry for 70 years. He was probably around 85 years old at the time of his last prophecy, the end of his ministry. And chapter 8 is probably his last, sort of right on the heels of seeing what's happening here. And he gets this vision here in chapter 8 about these two remaining kingdoms from chapter 7 and what's taking place. And they sort of survive, if you will, chapter 7. They go into chapter 8. And what takes place there, and what happens is one of the kingdoms rise up against the other kingdom. The goat rises up against the ram, and the goat survives and comes out of chapter 8. And this is mesmerizing and confusing and frustrating for Daniel. In chapter 9, he goes, "How long, O Lord? How long is this going to last? When are you going to restore your promises to the people of Israel?" And he goes back to the prophecy of Jeremiah, and he reads in Jeremiah that they're going to be in exile for 70 years. And Daniel says, it's been 70 years. When is he going to free us from exile? And what happens is an angel comes in and begins to address Daniel's questions. And the angel says, because of the sin and rebellion of Israel, they're not going to be restored in 70 years. That the 70 years are being multiplied by 7. There's going to be 490 years now before there's restoration. And Daniel is distraught over this. And he goes into his last vision, starting in chapter 10 through 12:4. And in this vision, you have this grand vision of really all the kingdoms of the earth coming to their demise. But it's dramatic, because it's one kingdom after the other defeating a kingdom. And then there's this great and mighty kingdom coming from the north that comes in and establishes itself and establishes idol worship in the temple of Jerusalem. And this great and mighty king comes in. But at the end of the beginning of chapter 12, we see that this kingdom too comes to an end, and there is life given, eternal life and resurrection provided to God's people. So we have this final hope here at the end of chapter 12. And so a lot of people wonder, what is this last battle, if you will, in Daniel? What does it refer to? It could refer to the Syrians in 160 BC. It could refer to the sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. Could refer to the coming of Christ at the end of the age. What does it refer to? And reality is, it doesn't fit. In a close read and analysis, it doesn't fit any of those particular events very well. So I actually wonder if it doesn't somehow fit all of them, but just not any of them precisely and specifically. That it fits this grand story that God is the King of kings, the Lord of lords. He is the one who will establish his kingdom, and his kingdom will be eternal, and the kingdoms of this world will not overcome him. And what we see in this ending is just the fulfillment of that story. And so I wonder if it's not something more like that. Instead of looking for specific events in history, either 160 BC, 70 AD, or even at the end of the age, to see that these last events in Daniel's book are referring to, it may just refer to this great theme, really in history. And the great theme can be captured this way. There's a pattern that when men do not live under the authority and the reign of God, they become beast. And in their beastliness and their fleshliness, they try to establish kingdoms for themselves. But God has made a promise to his people that in his grace and in his mercy, he's going to be faithful to that promise, and he will defeat the kingdoms of the earth, and he will establish an eternal kingdom for his people, and his people will find delight and blessing in that kingdom. And I think that's what we see, the great resolve in the book of Daniel. I look forward to hearing from some of you as you read through the book of Daniel in the next couple of weeks, and I'm very encouraged by this book. So if I can help you in any way, look me up. I'll be happy to help you.